okay to go? Okay, all right, so Growth and Natural Resources Committee is now in session. So our first item is Z 2518, 4315 Lead Mine Road. Beth.
Yeah, and actually I can just provide a super brief introduction. Y'all have seen this a couple of times, so I will not go through the entire presentation. And I know the applicant does have some additional conditions that they want to discuss with the committee that address some of the concerns that have arisen. But again, this is Lead Mine Road and Glenwood Avenue. Request to go from CX12 to CX7 does allow more housing. That's the reason for the apparent downzoning. Public hearing is still open and will come back on November the 6th to council. Another look at the site in case that's relevant during your discussion. I'll just have that up. So topics included stormwater, transportation impact. That was, I think, the key one that was outstanding. Tree conservation, housing affordability, and after the applicant, if there are questions for staff, Jason Myers from Transportation, and I'm also here to address any questions that you have.
Okay. All right. Anybody have anything at this time? Okay. All right, Beth.
Mr. Chair and council members, Beth Trejos, Nelson Mullins, here today on behalf of Coda Reedes in support of this zoning case. Since our last meeting, you sort of left us with two marching orders. One, we had agreed to a reduction in the number of permitted dwelling units from 350 to 275. And you had asked us to work with transportation staff on the access point across from North Hills Drive, and we have done that. This is the access point that you were concerned about. We do have some recorded obligations for cross-access to the PNC building here and the Candlewood Suites here. So what we agreed to do and put in our draft conditions is that our development would not have access to this drive, that we would have a gate that blocked off the access with a Knox box so emergency personnel could use it if needed, but that we would gain our access from the Marriott and Charles Drive intersection here. That would enable us to honor our contractual obligations to our neighbors for cross-access, but still fulfill your desire to have limited access at this location. I do have draft conditions, which I'm happy to pass out.
Yep.
Of course, not been formally filed. We will file them as soon as you close the public hearing. But we hope that this addresses all the comments that you had. I think you have been patient with us as we work through the issues. This is our third time before your committee.
So y'all check with the fire department about that, make sure they're good with the gate and the Knox box and all that?
So we talked with planning staff and with the transportation folks, and we're aware of other similar arrangements with Knox boxes, but we didn't talk specifically with the fire department about it.
So both transportation planning and engineering staff did meet with the applicant and review the condition, did not raise any objections. It wasn't shared specifically with fire, but I know the transportation engineering has that on their mind when they're looking at conditions like that.
So, I mean, the key, I guess, would be like similar to other schools or something like that where the fire department has the key to get in the boxes, not the owner of the property?
Yeah, they usually, as I understand it, have a key or a code that would enable them to access the drive.
Right.
But the condition clearly says that we can't use that as our access and that our primary access is Charles Marriott. So we will honor that commitment.
Okay. Okay. And also as far as you had something else.
As far as, I'm sorry?
Yeah, the change, I guess, in the frontage, the block perimeter.
Yes. So we have always had included in our conditions, modification of the block perimeter. Just as a belt and suspenders approach, we do have a pedestrian access point that we believe and staff believes meets the block perimeter requirements. But just to avoid any confusion, we included a language that the block perimeter was being modified as a part of the zoning case. And because we are closing this access point for our development, we increase that distance slightly in the condition.
Okay. All right. Anything else?
Well,
Yes.
on the list of open items, can we go back to that list in the presentation? Okay, so we dealt with the other ones?
Yeah, so we reported at your last meeting about these other issues. We did, prior to your June 12th meeting, we prohibited certain uses that had been requested of us.
Yep.
We increased the tree conservation area from 12,000 square feet to a minimum of 18,000 square feet, and we revised the stormwater condition using language that has been agreed to by stormwater staff. So the condition addresses post-development peak flow rates for the 2, 10, 25, 50, and 100-year storms, and prohibits direct discharge to the west, which is where Crabtree Valley is
Yeah,
located.
so it's all going to the east, I believe, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, no more to Crabtree, the mall part of it.
That's correct. Yes. So we worked very carefully on that.
Item 4?
So we did discuss housing affordability at the other meetings. We shared with you, Coteridi's model, and that these units are and will be more affordable. This application was filed more than a year ago. So we also started this process before, you had adopted a policy with regard to housing. And so, we left our last meeting with the marching orders of addressing the density issue and addressing the access issue. Of course, in addition, the pedestrian access way that we're providing with the switchback so that it's ADA accessible is a pretty significant investment to the public good here.
So, you made a comment about these are not going to be high-end, they're going to be relatively affordable. Is that what I heard you say?
In a prior meeting, we shared with you the rates that Coteridi's uses at for other apartments that they currently operate in the community. I think they've got 5 other active apartment complexes. And because we hadn't discussed it at our last meeting, I did not bring those rates with me, but we did share that information with you, and our impression was that that was satisfactory.
Okay. Anybody have anything else for them? So you'll bring revised conditions back to the next council meeting then?
Yes, sir. You have to close the public hearing before we can file them, but we're scheduled to come before you on November 6th. And our intention is to show up at the meeting with the signed conditions, and as soon as you close the hearing, we're going to give them to Jason.
So we need to close that here? Is that, or that's at the council meeting?
That's at the council meeting.
Okay.
Yeah, at this point, you're just making a recommendation back to the council that you believe the council should conduct the hearing.
Okay. Anybody want to make a motion to that?
So moved.
Okay. All right. So we've got a motion for approving the recommendation to send it back to the council with our approval based on those conditions, revised conditions that we're going to see. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Okay. Motion carries. Thank you very much. Jason, you're up to the next one, I guess?
That's right. So here to talk about the next section of the comprehensive plan update. And this is, again, part of that broader effort to update all the comprehensive plan. We're a fair ways through that now, so this is just a quick snapshot. So Section A, which was the overall framework and some of the portions that support that, now adopted, and also down there F, a couple specific sections that deal with historic preservation and arts and culture, also adopted. And then we have a few other big chunks dealing with land use, transportation, some other key issues that are set for work session or growth of natural resources. And we're here today to talk about C, so that's economic development, housing, and public input. And so these are those sections. So economic development, obviously thinking about cities' future growth and development and how that can be maximized. Housing has some changes related to changes that the Housing and Neighborhoods Department has undertaken in the direction of council in the last couple of years, reflecting some of the desire to address affordability even more aggressively. And then a new subsection about public participation, obviously a top issue, I think, on everybody's minds, and one that this section doesn't look to necessarily prescribe exactly the right way to do it, but instead to set out a pretty broad framework of basic principles that citizens of Raleigh should enjoy during that process. So the public hearing for this chunk has been closed. So it is now a special item at the committee. Committee can refer that back to council or consider it for further work. There's no time constraint on this. So I'm just going to go through briefly, I think some of the questions in particular were about the public participation and the intent, and also a look at some APA, American Planning Association, guidance on best practices for equity in planning. So I'll talk about that. But the idea of this subsection is that it's a tough thing to get right. And we know that there's a hunger for more meaningful and substantive input from the public, and we're always looking for ways to deliver that. And what this new section does, it's pretty brief, a couple pages, but it talks about fundamental rights that citizens of Raleigh ought to enjoy when it comes to meaningful engagement, the right to participate. And that thinks about how people access the planning process. In-person meetings are great, but aren't always convenient. Some people find it hard to attend them due to childcare or second jobs. Some people aren't meeting people, and that's fine. Some people are meeting people, and we need to think of ways to make those meetings even more meaningful and available. So that's one of the key rights. The second one, the right to understand. So I would ask you if you've ever heard a planner speak and wondered exactly what that planner was talking about. That occasionally happens, and I think it speaks, and it's not just a planning issue, it's probably a government issue overall, that we use clear communications when we're, especially always, but especially when we're dealing with the public. And I think critically that once we receive input, that people have an understanding of where it goes, that it's not going in a black box and you kind of wonder, you hope that maybe your really well thought out idea was considered during that process, but you don't have a real way of knowing. So some transparency and, okay, here's what we heard, and here's how that ended up shaping or not shaping the final product, and showing, not just telling what that looks like. And one more right, the right to an equal voice. And this has to do with the idea that, again, as we have multiple and newer methods for engagement, a lot of them online, that those are weighted equally. I think there's always a human tendency, the last person that we've talked to or the person right in front of us is sometimes the one that we hear, but there's a lot of people that participate in different ways. And for that participation to be meaningful, it needs to have that equal weight. So that's that final fundamental right. And this is a little twist. So the idea that with rights come responsibilities, and that this might be something that at the outset of a planning process, we might try to convey to the participants that there really is a need to consider, of course, and represent your own personal perspective, but also to consider the broader perspective of the city and the region, and not just now, but in the longer term as well. Because those are the questions that ultimately council has to think about. They are looking at a citywide perspective, and so it's reasonable to ask citizens to think, or do their best to think in those terms as well. So those translate to a couple of policies, really just reiterating those broad rights, access to participation, authentic participation, and equality of input. And then a particular action, which is a study, this is more getting into the specifics of how we actually accomplish these pretty broad goals. This is ongoing, and are soliciting public input on this itself. So a pretty meta process at this point, and hoping to deliver some recommendations to council in the new year about best practices. And ultimately that turns into a toolkit that we use and follow, can revise over time. I think there's always a process of iteration and exploration, but some really well-defined best practices I think will be really helpful to us. So last couple slides I want to mention are coming from some new guidance from, again, the American Planning Association, which obviously thinks about this topic a lot, and put out a Planning for Equity policy guide this year that has some suggestions, I think a little bit lower than the high-level broad principles, but aren't necessarily individual meeting techniques either. They're a little bit in between. And what they are, I'll just mention them briefly. Targeted community-specific strategies. So that's thinking about the methods that work for the specific community and not necessarily a one-size-fits-all approach. The meeting spaces are convenient and familiar, access to non-English speakers, strategies that involve touring the area with residents and more. So again, just understanding through their lens rather than the reverse in that process. Implement principles of participatory planning, so a high degree of collaboration, not necessarily just we're listening, but collaborating, not just placating, but meaningful involvement in the process. Building trust, that's a key one. I think everybody knows that sometimes there's some mistrust there. And so not only is there a responsibility to build that trust, but the process itself can do a lot of that work of establishing trust. And I think the key there is that it's ongoing. It's not just when there's a project or when there's something that we need some buy-in on, but that there's an ongoing conversation. Space to listen and heal old wounds. That's one, if anybody's been to a CAC, and obviously everybody up here has, things get brought up, and it's fair, and sometimes it's hard to move on if we feel injured without an acknowledgement or at least a chance to express what we feel. And that's not always present. That's something that can be really helpful if it's done meaningfully. And then avoiding duplication. This is one I know that we can improve on. Sometimes I feel like we're doing so much, but not necessarily always coordinating individual efforts. And that may seem good that we're doing so much, but from a citizen's perspective, it can be a little frustrating if I feel like, well, there was a meeting on this thing last week. Why didn't you tell me about this then? And which of these 3 upcoming meetings do I need to attend? So we need to be a lot more strategic about that. So it's easy to say these principles. It's going to be pretty tricky, and it's going to require some real thought and effort to implement them in the future, but I think they're pretty good ones. So the question now before the committee and then the council would be the question of this particular subsection, how to approach it. So I believe that as written, the subsection has some pretty broad, again, they're intended as just fundamental foundational principles. We have then from the equity guide some more specific but still fairly broad techniques. So I think that boils down to 3 options. One is to go ahead and adopt this, or the committee to recommend to adopt this as drafted, and then some more specific strategies taking from the APA guide can be included from the study that I mentioned is ongoing, and some really specific techniques as well. We anticipate that would be the case, that there's a lot that comes out of that study. Second option is wait to adopt this subsection until that public engagement study is complete and there's some more thought about that. And then a third one would be to go ahead and adopt the subsection and then could include in, say, a text box form, which is pretty typical in the comprehensive plan, that distillation of those 5 key strategies as some additional supplementary guidance from that subsection. So I think those are the 3 basic choices here before y'all. So there's, again, a couple other parts to this particular comprehensive plan update, also housing, economic development. So there may be questions on those. I know there's some questions about housing that Councilmember Stevenson has asked, maybe something for the committee to discuss, but wanted to see if there were any questions, again, about the public participation section first.
Yeah. So you talked about a public engagement study, and could you talk about the process and the scope of that?
Right, so that's ongoing now. We're actually, again, soliciting input through a survey on what works best. Also, that's including some internal interviews and some, I think, a really helpful discussion where we're reflecting on things that have gone well in the past and things that we would have done differently and tried to improve on. And also, there's been observation at our ongoing planning efforts, such as Midtown or some of the many other planning efforts that are happening right now, to see, and so we've hired consultants, and so they're observing that, and I know that they're drawing some suggestions and lessons from what they're seeing. They're also looking at best practices, obviously from other cities, and things that we can learn without necessarily reinventing the wheel. So pulling all that together, ultimately into a toolbox for strategies going forward.
Council member, another reference that I think that the committee members will be aware of, but those watching at home may not. So that body of work came out of a request and a budget allocation by the council that requested that planning put together a similar public outreach model similar to Parks, Recreation, and Cultural Resources. So he's speaking to the work that resulted from an original request from the council.
So we're engaging the public on how better to engage the public.
Exactly.
And who's the consultant?
Somebody may be able to step up and help me recall that. It's not at the tip of my tongue.
Sure, that's P3 Partners, Simone Robinson and Janetta Perry, working with Jackie Turner Consulting and Mickey Fern, and also Alta Planning.
Okay, and so what's their, I mean, I know Alta, wide-ranging expertise, but this is all about just, first of all, their own effort to reach out and engage the public on this topic, but then to have a conversation in a series of meetings, online surveys. What are the techniques you have in mind here?
Are you asking specifically about their public engagement strategy?
Yeah, how are they going to accomplish this goal?
I believe they've been holding meetings with internal stakeholders as well as with external stakeholders, and then I think the survey is the primary tool for engagement beyond that.
And are they incorporating any of the APA equity ideas around community engagement and empowerment?
I believe that they are. They are relying heavily on the IAP2 model.
Yeah.
The P3 Partners has experience working on federal and state projects as well, and is familiar with those regulations in terms of engaging with underrepresented populations.
Okay, and those presumably represent best practices.
Yes, sir, presumably.
Okay, all right, thanks.
I have
Yes, sir.
some comments. So this document that's attached to the agenda, response to City Council member questions about CP2C19. So there is this statement about ensuring enforcement of Federal Fair Housing Act to provide equal access to housing and prevent unfair lending practices. Reading through this, I recognize that federal law limits what we can ensure and what we cannot ensure. But rather than simply saying promote enforcement of Federal Fair Housing Act, and you limit it really to with this addition through landlord training and conferences. So that's a very specific limitation. I'm not sure why that was added. But rather than saying promote enforcement, and if there are limitations of federal law that limit what we can do, I think a better wording would be ensure as allowed by law enforcement of the Federal Fair Housing Act to provide equal access to housing and prevent unfair lending practices. I think that's how it should be worded.
I guess that,
Well, that came from our office, actually. Nicolette looked at it. We do not have, and I think that's fine, just knowing we can't do it. We would have to have, and we had talked about this before because we did have a board before, that we cannot do any fair housing enforcement at all without a local act from the General Assembly giving us certain powers that we don't have. I think Nicolette wrote it this way because that's what we're doing now.
Right.
The other thing you could do is say, including but not limited to, or something like that, to add more things. The reason that the insurer was changed is because we don't have the ability to do it. But if you put as allowed by law, I think that's fine too, but just knowing it's probably not getting you anything.
Well, I'd like to add that because if we have that language in the policy and then we do get a local act, then we got the policy already in place.
And as I said, that is absolutely not a problem to
Okay.
put ensure as allowed by law. I would probably add including landlord training then too, because those two things will not be ensuring.
That's fine, including but not limited to
Yeah.
landlord
yeah,
training
yeah,
and
yeah.
conferences.
Because landlord training and conferences are not going to ensure enforcement. See, they don't match up.
Right,
So
right.
we can work on some language that will get what you want probably and make it
Okay,
get where you need to be. I just want to explain that it was sent to our office for review, and she's the most familiar, and we have worked on this quite a bit in the last couple of months, and found out that we actually did once ask for a local act and didn't get it so a while back. So right now we're sort of tied, but it doesn't mean we can't ask, and it's not possible to do in the future.
right, and I think maybe the new council might be very energized to pursue something like a local act to ensure fair housing.
Yeah, and I said that's fine as long as you've got the wiggle room that it doesn't
Right.
ask us to do
what we can.
what we can.
Right. So you'll bring something back then? Okay.
Anybody else have anything on this
Well,
one?
so I'm going to,
Make sure you help me remember that when you.
Yeah, I made a note.
so I just want to make sure, I mean, you gave 3 options for moving forward with the public input part, and I'm happy with number 1. But I do want to make sure, and I, as, you know, 3 suggests that we're just going to put some of those APA policies in there without having had the public conversation, which doesn't make a lot of sense. But I do want to make sure that the consultant work explicitly engages on those APA equity policy items.
We can direct them to make sure that that's a key part of what they're looking at. And I know that they are looking at that equity lens pretty strongly, but we'll make sure that they have that.
Yeah, well, I mean, the reason I like being very specific about these APA equity policies is that it is a very specific document, and if we say that those will be incorporated fully into this input effort, then we'll know that it got addressed, as opposed to just saying, well, we're going to put the big equity lens umbrella out there, and it gives me less confidence that it will be an integral part of the consultant effort.
That would be a reasonable action that I think that you could take, would be to direct them to consider that or to incorporate that.
All right. So, all right, that's all I have on all of this.
Okay, so
Well, I
anybody,
should say, except for the housing part, if we're leaving that part out for right now, on the equity and fair housing part.
You want to go into that now?
Yeah, it's not going to be related to this other, so can we do a separate motion on picking one of these options with the stipulation that we're going to?
Jason, would you scroll back to the previous? Yep. No.
Sorry.
Yep.
3 options.
You want the 3 options?
Yeah, I think that's what we want.
Here we go. So
Okay.
I think the direction was option number 1.
1, but again, it talks about develop during the public engagement study. So my motion would be that we recommend back to council adoption of recommendation 1, and that that the public engagement study explicitly incorporate the APA equity policies items as part of that public engagement study.
And then your language
Well,
will be.
can we,
He wants to
is
do
that kind of a separate,
Do it
it's
that
a different
separate.
animal?
Okay. Yeah, we can do that.
Okay, so that's my motion.
Okay.
Then I'll second that.
Okay.
Okay. All right. All in favor?
Aye. Okay.
All
Thank you.
opposed? All
Appreciate
right. That passes.
And then my motion would be to go back to the proposed language regarding the Fair Housing Act to allow the city attorney to develop alternative language.
What I'm hearing you say is you want to make sure it gives us room to
Ensure.
ensure if and when we get the authority to ensure, but still continue to do the things we are doing,
Yes.
which are, whatever the other word was. Do
But
both.
not limited to those.
Right, right,
just those
right,
two.
right.
So you want Robin to draft that language, or?
I'll be glad to.
Whoever feels they're competent to do that.
She sounds like she's pretty,
I'm
not sure
What
the
what I think I'll
focus-
do is I'll put the ensure with the enforcement part, and then the furthering or the help with the things we're doing now, like the training, to
Right.
sort of split them up.
Okay, that sounds good.
Okay.
All right, that's your motion?
Is
The
that
clerk-
clear?
clerk got that?
Okay, so the motion is to change the language of, regarding ensuring in fair housing, to include the word ensure, and then limit, within the limits of the law. And then also to include options, examples of what we can do to promote, but not limited to those examples.
All right. Any other discussion? All right, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? All right, motion carries.
Okay, does that leave housing?
That leaves housing
Yes.
and economic development, but I don't believe there were any
I didn't have any.
questions about that.
All right, so Russ, you handed out some.
Yeah, and these are items that I had discussed with the planning staff on September 16th, and I guess they had taken some notes. And what this list is I just looked at policies related to housing that were proposed by staff to be removed. And the way the items, I've excerpted them here, is there's the policy language, and then bold italics after it is the explanation that staff gave for why they proposed to remove them. And so, and then at the end of each item, I've made my own counter proposal. And then this, so for instance, removed policy H 1.3, energy efficiency, ensure that all new publicly supported housing construction and rehabilitation meet energy efficient standards, such as those set by the current System Vision Energy Guarantee Program. I'm not sure whose program that is. But going on, this policy was removed. This is the staff reasoning for wanting to remove it. This policy was removed because the city does not control all of the publicly supported housing being constructed or rehabbed throughout the city. Also, Department of Housing and Urban Development has greatly increased energy conservation standards for projects that receive federal funding. And my comment is that improving energy, generally consider reinstating and revising the policy to seek innovative energy efficiencies in addition to / beyond federal standards. The idea is that unless there's some explicit policy statement about housing related to improving energy efficient globally, this seems to remove that, saying other people are taking care of it. So we don't care about the general policy aspiration of improving energy efficiency and housing, and so it just seemed like it would be better just to, instead of saying someone else is taking care of that now, which may or may not be true in the future, just to say this still is a policy of us to promote energy efficiency in housing.
So I think a comment related to all of these, I think staff has received this today with these languages. Much of this is a policy call in terms of where you believe the priorities of the city should be. I don't know that our housing and neighborhood staff have had a chance to review these to say what would be the workload or staff impacts of some of those. If that's something that the council would wish to happen, we could certainly do that. But I don't know that today we could speak to how our activities or our programming might change as a result of these remaining in the plan.
Okay, again, these went through each of these individually back on September 16th, so it's not totally brand new. And staff took notes at the time, but that's neither here nor there. I've got it all drafted up here now. Personally, these things have been in the comp plan since 2009. It hasn't generated staff workload till today that I know of. So it's just a matter of whether we feel like these are items that are dealt with elsewhere, or they're no longer policy goals for us. But I'm not in a big rush to get an answer today, if that's what you're saying.
Nikki, you want to address?
Yes, sir. Generally speaking, we're okay. We did meet earlier and we talked about this. Actually, we think your suggestions are pretty thoughtful, and we're okay with all of them outside of H2.8. We can't speak to that from housing and neighborhood standpoint, but everything else, Mr. Stevenson, we're okay with.
Okay, well, I'm happy to talk about that one.
What is that one?
Accessory dwelling units.
Oh, okay.
So the proposed action here by staff is to remove policy H2.8 accessory dwelling units from the comp plan. And so the language of that policy is promote the construction of accessory dwelling units above garages or granny flats and cottage/small lot ordinances to provide affordable workforce housing options and help accommodate future citywide residential demand. This was and replaced with policy LU, land use policy, as opposed to housing, 8.16 accessory dwelling units that supports the provision and regulation of ADUs. So my comment on that is that replacement language in this land use policy 8.16 refers to, quote, expanding housing option, but does not recommend ADUs as an affordable or workforce housing option. Consider expanding rather than removing this policy by continuing to promote innovative strategies. And in this example I gave, such as in Los Angeles, where the city offers cash incentives to homeowners to subsidize construction of ADUs for homeless residents. So there's a lot of best practices out there that are still evolving about how we can achieve many comp plan goals through the production of accessory dwelling units. And so again, it's fine if there's a land use policy related to ADUs, but it seems like it does, as I said, it doesn't really recommend ADUs as an affordable or workforce housing option. And so it'd be nice if we didn't remove a policy that promotes accessory dwelling units as an affordable housing option.
Sure. So two things. One, it would be perfectly fine to leave it in. We're at the point in the process where staff has brought forward material to you that's been vetted with the public, and if this is the last opportunity for you to influence the policy, and if you say you didn't get it quite right, I want this change, that's exactly what this process is for. So if the committee agrees to that, that's an easy change. Again, to make a recommendation in the way that Mr. Cox did about the other housing policy regarding insure versus promote. If you all want to leave it in, that's perfectly fine. And I think Mr. Jones from Housing and Neighborhoods is saying it's not a big part of our Housing and Neighborhoods program. And so I guess just the thing to keep in mind is that they're not actively pursuing that as part of the affordable housing strategy. But of course, we could include that as part of the land use regulation as an option to address informally the affordability issue.
But not a housing policy option, which is what
You
we're
can
talking
leave it
about.
in there if you like.
Well-
I mean, I think part of what Mr. Jones is saying is that's not currently part of their program, and so are you giving them specific guidance that you want to add that to the?
We have some very
work
aspirational
program.
policies in our comp plan that have never been implemented in any way, shape, form, but that doesn't mean they're not great aspirational policies that someday we'll say, you know what, this policy about getting to, carbon neutral development in our city, that really is a great thing, and why is it not in here anyway? So I prefer to err on the side of being more aspirational about new ideas that may come along, and that we'll have some policy basis for exploring those, rather than taking it out and then go, okay, how do we get this restarted from scratch?
Right, so I think the process at this point, if you want to accomplish that, is to get your colleagues on the committee to agree with your motion, right? Yeah.
Well, I mean, we got a whole list here, and I don't know to the extent that they want to look through there and say, no, that one really needs to be gone. I don't know why you want to keep it in there, so I'm sort of, I mean, I've given it my own thought. I've discussed it with staff back in September and thought about it some more and wrote it up, but.
Would you phrase it as a motion?
Well, just that these, my comments suggest that there's some more writing to do, because some of these things, there's some reasons why they were taken out, but I'm saying, okay, but there's some alternative reasons maybe to leave it in. So I'm thinking my motion would be along the lines of take my comments and then propose some revised language. Would that be the motion? Okay.
And then second.
Right. That was quick. So my motion is that we take this list that I handed out to everyone and ask staff to go back and look at revised, rather than removing these policies and actions, that look at revised language for them that attempts to address the comments that I've made in the document.
And that's my second.
Okay.
You understand what he wants?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, we can accomplish that pretty quickly.
Okay. All right. You'll be available to meet with them if need be?
Yeah, sure.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. All right. All right, so we have a motion and a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Okay.
And then the last section was economic development. I don't know that there were any particular questions or concerns, but that was just part of that same chunk of plan that's moving through. And I don't think that's been addressed individually today.
Anybody have any comment about that? Nope. All right.
So is staff coming back to this committee with those language alterations, or are they?
So that's up to the committee. You do have a work session that you have calendared on the topic of comprehensive planning changes. So certainly staff could try, I think, to incorporate the request into that environment if that would meet the needs. In that case, I think you would want to report it out of your committee.
Okay, that'd be fine with, if it is with the rest of you. That it doesn't come back here, the comments don't come back here, but come back to a work session.
November 12th, I believe, isn't it? Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
So, for the economic development piece, do we need to vote on that and move that out too, or?
No, I think this is all the same referral, so I think you could make a motion to refer the item back to the council, including all of the prior motions that you made.
A meta motion.
Yeah, so we're just, all of it, and that's going to be the next council meeting? Would that be? That's right.
Okay, and so this is a motion on the topic of CP-2C19. Okay, well, I'll make a motion that we report out CP2C19 from the Growth and Natural Resources Committee back to full council with the incorporation of the sub-motions that have been made here. And do I need to make a specific note about the work session?
You can if you like.
Okay, and that the housing items discussed here would be proposed modified language that staff develops will be then presented at the work session on November 12th. Okay. That's my motion.
Second.
Okay, all right. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? All right, motion carries. Okay. All right, next is zoning condition case TCZ 2-19. Sir, are you here to speak about that?
Yes, I am.
Come on down to the front if you don't mind. Okay,
All right, good afternoon.
good afternoon.
Again, this is TCZ 2-19.
You can take a seat when, we'll call you when he's finished. Thank you. Yes.
And this is to amend the conditions associated with zoning case Z-40-01. And the property is located at 4501 Durley Road. This went before the Northwest CAC on July the 9th, and they gave it a favorable vote by 9-1. Briefly, there's 7 conditions on the property that govern the stormwater regulations, the requirement to recombine the properties, right-of-way reimbursement, requirement for a natural protective yard and setback on Durley Road, cross access to the properties to the north and west, lighting, and a requirement for landscaping buffer to the adjacent properties. The petitioner is requesting to remove 5 of these existing conditions, to keep 2 of them and modify 1 other. Conditions 1, 3, 5, and 7 will be removed. And condition number 4 will be revised to read that the building setback from Durley Road shall be a minimum of 20 feet, and the area within this setback will have roughly, or 51% of it, at least 51% of it vegetated. This condition was revised from the original 30-foot natural protective yard and 50-foot setback from Durley. Again, this is one of the conditions that's being removed. Prior to redevelopment, they would offer a cross access to the properties to the north and west. And condition 7 would also be removed, and that's for that 20-foot natural protective yard along the south property line. These conditions will remain and will be renumbered accordingly. Prior to redevelopment of the property, the parcels will be recombined to a single parcel, and the site lighting, including the wall pack fixtures, will be cut off, full cutoff design. Just to have these side by side, on the left you see the current conditions. On the right is the proposed conditions, the strike through. So you can see that again that 1, 3, 5, and 7 will be removed, and that 2 and 6 will remain and be renumbered, and condition number 4 will be revised to read that a building setback of 20 feet will be along Durley Road, with at least 51% of it being vegetated. And this is a clean copy of what those conditions will look like if they are approved. Now, in speaking with the property owner applicant, these conditions, the current conditions on this property, were placed there back when some 21 years ago, when there was the greenway behind this property to the rear of this property was in its very early stages, and it was the city that wanted to have access to that greenway and through this property. And that is the reason some of these conditions were placed on this property. Now, with the current state of the greenway and where these conditions are really not necessary because they were originally tied to that greenway. The applicant is here today and can further elaborate on that if the committee wishes to hear that. This is scheduled to go back to the council on the 6th of November, and these are the conditions again that have been in place since May. So staff is available for any questions.
So 1 and 3 are being removed because they're covered. They're redundant. They're covered someplace else. Is that correct?
That's correct. They're not necessary due to the current requirements of the UDO.
And what about 5 and 7? The original 5 and 7, are they also? What's the reason for removing them?
Those came at the request of the applicant. He could probably better elaborate on those as to why he would like to see those removed. And again, I think those had something to do again with the possibility of the greenway, the connection to the greenway to the rear or west of this property.
And so the original condition 4 had a 50-foot setback, and 30 feet of that was natural protective yard, 30 of the 50, is that correct? I don't quite understand what was you know, what
There,
that
there
meant.
was, yes, there was a building setback off of Durley Road of 50 feet, and then a 30-foot strip along Durley Road had to be a protective yard.
Okay.
And what is being proposed here is more in line with what's required through the UDO currently.
Okay.
Okay. All right, sir, you want to come on up? Can you give us your name and address, please?
Hi, thanks for having me here. I'm Don Washington, and my wife and I are here. And back 20-odd years ago, the city needed our property to widen Durley Road. And I wanted to understand the impact of the road on my property there. So I said, well, let me go to the city council and talk to them about that. And I spoke with John Phelps, who is the supervisor of surveyors, and he helped me with the process. And since I was surrounded by R6, and the city council agreed with me that the future use of the property would be best served at a higher density, and the traffic volume on the road, and so I applied for that, and it passed, and it was quite a process for me, educational, as the 6 meetings that I've been to get these conditions removed. And speaking with John, the Greenway came into conversation because I didn't understand all the conditions. So we just agreed, and it was rezoned. And what transpired now, and I understood the council's thrust to and planning to think ahead to the future, and that, for instance, they put in a double sidewalk at the front of the property, and not knowing where the Greenway was going to go, and as I learned, it was all wrapped up in court for over 20 years. And Kate Crowder can speak of this. I've emailed her.
What's a double sidewalk?
Well, here's a picture of it, and it's twice the size of a normal sidewalk.
Oh, so you mean in width, not 2 sidewalks?
That's correct.
Okay.
So they just made it really wide.
Yeah.
And that was for Greenway or for future need. The sidewalk goes nowhere now, just goes in front of my home there. So then I looked and read the court settlement that they made with Hanson Quarry. And after a 20-odd year court battle, they settled. And Hanson Quarry agreed not to develop south of Crabtree Creek, and that the Greenway wasn't going to go through my property, or my property wasn't going to be affected by the Greenway. And I felt that as the first 2, the 1 and 3 conditions were moot because they're covered under different ordinances now. And the fact that the Greenway, they've decided the route and it's going 100 feet south of my property, and that the quarry's not allowed to develop the property behind me or beside me. And they are now putting all the slag from all the gravel right adjacent to my property there. And so the property, and they have another 30 years to operate. And so I feel that the conditions that Mark has helped me with, the fact that the court settlement, those conditions are moot. And we don't need a road going to nowhere. And as far as the Greenway folks go, they wanted to buy the property. This is what prompted this whole process. The Greenway people asked to buy my property, and I offered it to them for $75,000 less than the appraised value. We support the Greenway, and and they said it wasn't in the budget because they got the appraisal back. And this is for my wife's and my retirement. We've held on to it for 21 years. And we can't speak what a developer will do to it. I don't know, but I just feel that it's reasonable and fair that the original conditions be removed and to give us an opportunity to decide what to do with it in the future. Anybody, any questions?
Well, offer my sympathy for all that you've had to go through, for something that got resolved in hopefully a way that's going to be ultimately better for you, but that you had to live through all of that and work through all of that. I actually have a question for staff.
Sure.
And that is, looks like there's, to the south is developed R4 lots. To the west and the north is just R6 base zoning, right?
Yes.
So I'm trying to figure out why we want to, and pardon me, I'm just ignorant, and maybe there's an obvious answer, but why do we want to continue any of the conditions on this property?
Well, to the south is R4.
Yeah.
Okay, and to the north and west, and the east is R6.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that really came with discussions with the applicant. I mean, if
So, well, I guess that maybe it is a question for you. Did you like the conditions that you proposed to remain?
Yeah, the conditions that I proposed, I worked with the planning department, and I took pictures. I talked to all the neighbors, and I looked at the development that happened on Raleigh Road. There's a builder across the road with a 20-foot setback, and I worked with the planning department on that, and through pictures and so on. And are you referring to the 20-foot?
All right. Can you put the list of proposed conditions back up on the screen? So, see them here. Can't find them in the report. Okay. Vicki, are those,
Sorry?
it seems like if this parcel is going to be recombined, the first one suggested it won't be developed at R6, especially if we're talking about wall pack fixtures, which don't really relate to this current development at all.
Usually a
It's like, why do we need
commercial
any of this on here?
Well,
I would agree with that, but the city council agreed with me that the use of the property down the line would be higher, denser residential. And there has been neighborhood commercial and other uses back then that had taken place on Raleigh Road. And I think that's maybe why the site lighting was put in there.
But that would all come back in a rezoning case.
Yeah, it'll be decided later.
Yes,
I agree with that.
Yeah.
But again, I am a layperson. I can't speak of that. I did in my initial request. I said my request is fair and it's reasonable.
Yeah.
That's.
And again, if you like these conditions.
No, I'd be happy to have all of them gone, and that if somebody wants to do something with the property, then absolutely.
Attorney.
We'll go
You might
with the
need to
process.
renotice it if you were to take them all out, because essentially you'd be zoning it to a general use district, because it wouldn't have any. So I was going to say, if you're happy with them, that's one thing. But I don't know that we wouldn't have to renotice it if you took them all out.
Well, I mean,
the thing about it is, if this gentleman's fine with it, why change it?
because if it gets recombined and redeveloped, it'll all go away anyway. With
But
another zone.
and in discussion with the city attorney, was the first, we're, I think, the first people to request a simple text change. And in order to meet the legal criteria of a text change, that We couldn't just remove all of them.
Okay.
In order for it to be a text change that, and we agree to these. We don't see these encumbering us and can be dealt with when the property is, somebody decides what they want to do with it after I retire.
So this is in your district, Steph.
Yeah.
You okay?
If the applicant is happy, I'm happy.
Thank you, folks.
So move, wait, do I read a consistency statement, or are we just?
No, we're just in committee, so you're
We're just
good.
recommending, that's right.
Okay, so I move that we send this back to council with the recommendation to approve this.
So this already is, was continued to a public hearing, so you'll hold the public hearing on November 6th.
All right, was that a second? Second. So before we vote on this, I'm going to mention this to you,
Yes.
that in looking through the notes, I approved your rezoning when I was on the planning commission, May 23rd, 2001. I got your back.
Oh, thank you, buddy. Well, that is,
Yeah.
that is
I'm
great.
dating myself here.
Geez, I owe you twice.
Maybe you'll be back when he comes back the next time.
No, no, no. Oh, no, this is it.
Yeah, that's it. I agree with you.
Thank you very much.
All right, all in favor,
Thank
say
you
aye.
so much.
Aye. All opposed? All right, motion carries. Anything else from anybody? All right, we're adjourned. Thank you very much.